These games are awful. EA Sports came out with a series of 5 games before NBA Live came out in 1994. These earlier games are slow, they are poorly made, and they are simply no fun to play. The focus back then was on graphics, but the truth is that the animations are really bad. And even NBA Showdown, which was considerably faster, was an awful game. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, if you've been watching my gameplay videos for some of these games, you already know how I feel about them. They totally suck. But just saying that these games suck is not enough. In fact, I keep getting people in the comments like all the time telling me that these games are actually really good, that I just don't understand, that they are simulations, that they're like really accurate and stuff like that. So I'm going to show you here why these games are awful. As you already know, Lakers vs. Celtics and the NBA playoffs was an IBM game released way back in 1989. Good luck finding a working computer that can read these bad boys. Back in those days, the emphasis here was on graphics, and in particular the signature moves that each player had. So the thing about Lakers vs. Celtics on the PC is that it's actually not a bad game. I would argue that it's the best out of this early series before NBA Live came out. In fact, I would argue that the Genesis version of the same game is clearly inferior. And that's really impressive because we're talking about a 1989 IBM game that came on 2 of those 5.25-inch floppy disks. As you can see, there's a strong emphasis here on the graphics, basically making sure the players look like the guys they're supposed to look like. The game is a bit slow though, it's actually slower than the Genesis versions. But remember that we are talking a 1989 IBM game here. And that's a point I cannot stress enough. Computers in 1989 were nothing like computers are today. Now you can probably imagine this, but let me show you just how different things were. According to this January 1990 issue of PC World, $4,500 would get you a 386 with an 80 megabyte hard drive, 1 megabyte of RAM, and 64 kilobytes of cache memory. This computer was probably a little bit closer to your price range, $2,500 for 1 meg of RAM, a 40 megabyte hard drive, but notice that it's got a mono graphics card, which means no color. The system requirements on the box don't make it all that clear precisely what you need, other than what I assume is 384 kilobytes of disk space. Actually though, the full game takes up about 610 kilobytes, so I'm not entirely sure what that number refers to. But like, whatever. I mean, the important thing here is that you really need to have state-of-the-art equipment in 1989 to play this game the way that you can today. In other words, you can't necessarily look at this and be like, oh, computers back then were just fine and, you know, fine and dandy and all this stuff. Chances are really good that the majority of people couldn't even run the game. Now, the emphasis in this game was on the signature moves. You can tell which player is which by the faces and the numbers, sure. But the moves make it absolutely clear who is who. According to the manual, you tell the player when to shoot and then he decides what kind of move he's going to make. Confusingly though, the amount of time you hold the button down also determines what your shooting percentage is. And if you hit the shoot button by accident while you're learning the controls, you will be called for traveling. It's not an awful idea to have shots determined by how long you hold down the button. In fact, almost all basketball games have that mechanic. The problem here though is that whatever system helps the player like decide when to use his signature move turned into a hotspot system when the game went to the Sega Genesis. The Genesis version of Lakers vs. Celtics is faster, well, kind of faster. The graphics are a little bit better, though they lack some of the precision of the PC game. But the biggest problem here is figuring out who your player is. In the original game, the player you control has a black jersey. The problem is that both teams happen to have a player with a black jersey, and it's not always that easy to see the colors of the trim of the uniform to tell them apart. This is also why you couldn't play this game if you didn't have a color video card. In the Genesis game, your player's shoes are black. but this can be even harder to see. Okay, so this is the first major problem. You can tell me all day long about how the game is supposedly realistic or a simulation, but it's a really, really crappy simulation of the sport if I can't even tell who I'm controlling, right? The later versions of the game stick a star under the guy you control. That kind of makes it easier, but it doesn't always work all that well. And as you can see in these short clips, it feels like the game got slower as time went on. Anyway, this is one of those really, really rare times back in the early 90s where the PC game was almost certainly better than the console version if you had like a $4,000 PC. See, usually it was the other way around. People could craft games for specific console requirements. They could run hacks to make sure that they could take advantage of the way that the hardware worked, especially on the NES. But PC requirements were much different. It was very difficult to make a game that looked and played really well on every single variant of PC that was out there at the time. But it is clear that the PC version of Celtics versus Lakers was clearly better. Now, the biggest problem with this Genesis game is that you've got to find the hot spots when you're on offense. So to shoot, you're supposed to push the A button. In theory, the player decides how to shoot the shot, and your success is based on who the player is, how closely he's being guarded, and when you release the A button. In practice, the thing you need to do is find the hotspots on the floor that trigger the signature move animations. This is actually more clear starting with the second game of the series, Bulls vs. Lakers, and the system that the manual calls marquee shots. So for example, if you want Hakeem Olajuwon to do a 360 slam, you need to stand in a certain number of pixels, generally up by the free throw line. The same is true of Michael Jordan. To get him to make a spectacular move, you need to move away from the basket, not towards it. In fact, almost every single marquee player has a move that requires you to be somewhere around the free throw line, regardless of what is logically happening during the game. And all of these games feature the exact same logic. This is the part of the series that just drives me nuts, and I will show you why. In general, you would think that you'd want to move your best players close to the basket to make a slam dunk. That's how it works in Tecmo NBA Basketball on the NES. That's also how it works in Tecmo NBA Basketball on the Sega Genesis. Of course, that is how it works in NBA Jam. Run and Gun works the same way. Even really, really crappy games like Ultimate Basketball use the same logic. In these games, you've got to move away from the basket to execute a signature move. It's backwards and it makes no sense. Now, the worst part is that in Lakers vs. Celtics and the other NBA playoff games, you just can't defend any of those moves. In fact, I don't know how to play defense at all in any of these games. Nothing works. The DOS version of Lakers vs. Celtics is actually a bit more forgiving on defense, believe it or not. Your computer teammates actually play defense and they can actually stop things. Meanwhile, if you play a game like Team USA Basketball on the Genesis, you will discover that your teammates can do absolutely nothing. Defense in this game is nearly impossible because of the marquee shots and the signature moves. Once the other player triggers one of those, you cannot do a single thing to stop it. So do you see what I'm saying, right? All of these comments I keep reading about how this game is realistic and a simulation and whatever, this is just garbage. There's nothing realistic about any of this. Nobody goes back to the free throw line to step on the right square and trigger their signature move. I mean, like NBA Jam is more realistic than this. I'm dead serious. Anyway, EA came out with 3 of these games in 1992 for some really strange reason. Even with so many versions to choose from, the gaming press was still unusually positive about the games. GamePro gave Bulls vs. Blazers a stellar review, even though it wasn't significantly different from the other 2 EA Sports basketball games that came out that same year. And if you play the game, you will notice right away that it is extremely slow. Now, EA Sports had a big issue back in those days with some of its games being really slow. The basketball games, however, were the biggest offenders of this. The original John Madden Football might have received a ton of praise, but it takes forever to complete a game. Even in Madden 93, you will find yourself spending a ton of time waiting for players to run on and off the field, which is totally ridiculous. The focus on animations in these basketball games means that there's really no flow to the gameplay, which is what makes them no fun to play at all. NBA Showdown 94 is faster, which is nice. But it still has the same stupid signature shot and hotspot system in its game. And then you've got other bizarre things like the completely random foul system. Anyway, as you can tell, I am not a huge fan of these games. But this does not mean that I dislike EA Sports games in general. Actually, I kind of like the company as long as you're talking about games that don't suck. In contrast to all of this, NBA Live 95 is actually a lot of fun. The isometric camera angle does take some getting used to. However, it's easy to see where your teammates are and the game feels a lot more natural. You see, one of the problems with the old horizontal games is that things would feel really congested, like in the old Tecmo Basketball on the NES. The isometric perspective really opens up the court, even though it can be hard sometimes to figure out where you are in relation to the basket. This is the sort of game I could see myself playing over and over again. In contrast, these old games are just absolutely horrible. So there's my take on the old EA basketball games. I know that a lot of you disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. But you do have to remember that these games are not simulations, nor are they particularly realistic. At best, they are sloppy.